Hey guys, welcome back to the Curly Reader. My name's Amanda, and today I'm going to share with you all of the books that I read in the month of July. All right, so during the month of July, I read 10 books. It was a very audiobook heavy month. 8 of them were audiobooks. 2 physical books, and a couple that I partially finished, but I haven't quite gotten through yet. So yeah, and then of those 10 books, I had 3 that I owned and 7 that I borrowed from somewhere or that were from NetGalley, because I count my NetGalley books as borrowed, even though I technically own them on an ebook, but whatever. That's just how I personally like to track it. And then I had 5 middle grade books, 1 YA book, 4 adult books, and I read 4 books from NetGalley this month. So that's a really good number. So yeah, let's just kind of get into it, and I will share with you what I have. I will say that I did finish the first 2 books of Les Mis, so I am tracking along. This is how far I am, and this is how much I have left to go. So we still have about a month and a half left of this read along. So if you would like to join us, I will link the announcement video for the read along down below. It's been a ton of fun to be able to read this with a group of people, and it definitely has me in the mood to rewatch the musical. But that is one of the books that I have partially finished. The other one, which I don't think I brought down here, but I started a thriller. I didn't finish a thriller. A thriller was on my TBR for the month, and I didn't finish a thriller, but I started a thriller. And so I've been reading Someone We Know by Sherry Lapina, and I'm about halfway through that. So I will finish that here in the next couple of days, but it's not quite done yet. So those are the 2 books that I started but did not finish. And then, yeah, the rest of these, let's just kind of get into it. So the book that I ended up reading for Chantel at An Intentional Life's Read Your Bookshelf Challenge was Artemis Fowl, The Arctic Incident. The challenge for the month of July was to read a book whose title started with the first letter of your first name. And so one of my annual goals was to read through the Artemis Fowl series, and I've not been doing very good. So I figured I should probably make some headway, and this one fit the bill. So I ended up reading this one. I actually read half of this physically and then listened to the last half of it. It was just taking me a really, really long time to get through. And so I ended up picking up the audiobook to just kind of push me through the last part of it. I didn't like this one as much as I liked the first one. I think I'll still continue on with the series as a whole, but this one was just okay for me. I ended up giving it 3 stars. Artemis Fowl is about this like super genius child, but he is kind of like a super crime guy. I don't know. Anyway, in the first book, he steals some leprechaun gold, and it's about that. This kind of goes from there with the same characters. But the leprechauns and fairies and trolls and all that, dwarves, all that kind of thing, are very high tech. They live underground. It's a lot more sci-fi than fantasy, kind of. So it's a lot of fun. But this one for me had 2 different like conflicts that were going on simultaneously. You had the conflict that Artemis was dealing with, and then the conflict that the fairy people were dealing with. And I didn't like the split kind of conflict there. I wish it would have just been like one central plot instead of 2 that were kind of merged. But one definitely took more of a backseat. It was just kind of random, some of the stuff in here. Didn't like it as much as the first one, but I still enjoyed it. It was still fun. 3 stars. All right. I then had 2 buddy reads that unfortunately both were not very good. So the first one is The Book Charmer by Karen Hawkins. I had picked this up just as a cover buy at the thrift store, and this to me was a miss. The back of it says that it is about this girl who books talk to her and she can recommend books to people, and that was like this much of the story. So it did have a character who had this, it was almost like magical realism, where the books actually talked to her and she would give books to people, but none of the books like really played a role in the story at all. And so it really could have been completely left out of the book and it wouldn't have made a difference. At the same time, like there was no point to the story really. It was a very kind of reminded me of a Hallmark movie where it's like big town girl moves to the little town, learns to love the little town, but there was like a hint of a romance, but not really, and it was just very odd. I ended up giving it 2 stars. Not my cup of tea. The other one was that I read was also a miss, and it's The Mermaid by Christina Henry. This was on my annual TBR, and this one, if I thought The Book Charmer didn't have a purpose at all, like this one had no plot, like at all. The characters were very one-dimensional. There was no conflict. It was like, I got to the end and I'm like, why did I just read that? That made no sense. There was like no point to the whole story. The writing was just okay. It was just not good. And it's a shame because this cover, like the book is beautiful. What's inside of it? It was 2 stars. All right, one that I physically read this month that I just kind of picked up on a whim, that I ended up loving is Wife After Wife by Olivia Hayfield. This is a modern take on Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So it follows Harry Rose, who is the Henry of the situation, and he is a media mogul. He is like super, super rich, lives in London, and it just follows him and all of his women. And coming on the heels of last month when I went on and on about how infidelity was bothering me, like the fact that I love this and gave it 5 stars is questionable, but I knew what I was getting into when I picked this up. I think that was the difference. Is like I went through a huge Tudor phase probably about 12 years ago where I was super, super into Tudor history. I read Philippa Gregory books just like one right after the other. I watched the show The Tudors. I was super into it. And so this for me was just fun. Is it the best thing I've ever read? No. It was so much fun. Would I reread it? Yep. Did I go out and buy it after I read it? Yeah. Did I purchase the sequel, which is about Elizabeth and Mary? Yeah, I did. And I plan on reading it as soon as it comes in. This was just fun. Lots of infidelity, lots of, shenanigans happening, but it told it from the point of view of the wives and Harry as well. And it never once made it seem like what he was doing was okay. And so that for me was a little bit redemptive. And so anyway, if you're into Tudor history, I would recommend it because it was loads of fun. All right, and then I read The Nature of Fragile Things by Susan Meisner. This is Susan Meisner's newest book, and it follows a woman during the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 that was like huge and resulted in massive fires and all of that. So she is actually from Ireland and immigrated to New York, and then from New York answered a letter for like a mail order bride out on the West Coast and goes out to the West Coast and marries this man who has a daughter. And so she kind of takes the role of stepmom in this child's life. And it's kind of her story of what happens with her right before the earthquake, during the earthquake, after the earthquake. It was good. I really wish that right in the middle of it, there's a plot twist. And I wish that the energy from that plot twist would have carried throughout the rest of the book. I felt like the end of the book just kind of like tapered off and it wasn't as exciting. Whereas the middle of it, I'm like, whoa, this is like high energy, it's like right amidst the earthquake kind of stuff. And then it just kind of like went downhill. So the pacing was definitely off for me. It wasn't great, but it wasn't awful either. Like I've read both from Susan Meisner. I really, really loved As Bright as Heaven. I really didn't care for Fall of Marigolds. So this is kind of in the middle of those for me. I still have another one from her that I would really like to read. So I think I ended up giving this one 4 stars though. After that, I listened to The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Sorry, I had to look down because I couldn't remember who wrote it. But I listened to The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. The reason that I listened to this is because it came up on two very, very, very different booktubers mid-year freakout tag videos, and it had me intrigued. So I saw it on Read with Cindy, who I think is now just with Cindy on YouTube. Her mid-year tag, and then Chanel at An Intentional Life also mentioned it, and they are like the polar opposite as far as reading and just life and things like that. And so the fact that it came up on both of them, I was super intrigued. But this is a mystery that's kind of like Knives Out. I've heard it's like Knives Out meets The Westing Game, but I've never read The Westing Game. I have seen Knives Out though. But it is about this teenage girl who basically gets called in because she's mentioned in the will of this multimillionaire. And she ends up inheriting like his whole fortune. And she's like, oh, I don't know this guy. I have no idea what's going on. And he has 4 grandsons that are all like, what the heck? And so they're trying to figure out why she got the inheritance and they didn't. And it's just kind of this mystery. It was really good. The only thing I will say is that the 4 grandsons were really hard to like distinguish between sometimes. It was just because there's 4 of them, it's a lot of characters, and so it was kind of hard to figure out who was who. I did listen to this one on audiobook. The narrator was fantastic. It takes place in Texas, and so she had a very Texas Western accent, and it was great. So I will say that I ended up giving this one 4 stars. Okay, and then after that, I ended up reading 2 books that were very similar to each other. I didn't realize when I picked up the first one that it was similar to the second one, but you know, it is what it is. So the first one that I picked up was Aftermath by Emily Barth Eisler, and this one actually comes out on September 7th, but it follows this girl whose younger brother has passed away, and he was fighting a terminal illness. You know this going into it, and he's passed away, and her family, because they're trying to kind of get a new start, decides to move, and they move into a community that the school had a school shooting, and the class that the girl is going into is the class that had the school shooting. And so all the kids she's going to are survivors of this school shooting. And her parents think that she'll be able to relate to them because they've both faced death. But when she goes to the school, she finds that everybody is very hesitant to connect with her. And they talk about the school shooting all the time, just very flippantly. And it really makes her uncomfortable. And anyway, and she really likes math. She's really into math. This was just weird. This book was very weird for me. I didn't love it. There were a few different plot points that just didn't really make a lot of sense to me. One of her teachers really encourages her to take part in this mime class, and he tells her, I think that you'd be really good for it. And I'm like, why? There's nothing, she doesn't go to the school, he doesn't really know her. Why would he encourage her to do miming? It was just very weird. So I ended up giving this one 2 stars. I just wasn't a huge fan of the writing. But the second book that I read, kind of a similar premises, is Shape of Thunder by Jasmine Warga. And Jasmine Warga wrote Other Words for Home, which is phenomenal. I believe this one's also written in verse. I only say that because I listened to the audiobook, and so it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. But this one also is about a school shooting, and it follows 2 friends. I think they live next door to each other, I'm not sure, but they are best friends, and they haven't that's not a word. They have not spoken in a year because one of the girls, her brother shot in a school shooting the other one's sister. So the other one's sister died in a school shooting that was the fault of the one's brother. I hope that all made sense. It was very convoluted the way I just worded all that. Anyway, and so they're both dealing with a lot. They're dealing with a lot of grief. They're dealing with a lot of hurt. They're just dealing with a lot, and they're trying to figure out how to come back together and be friends again. And this one was done so well. In the synopsis, it mentions time holes or wormholes and kind of time hopping and that sort of thing. And I was very concerned going into it. I was like, this might be a little too out there for me, but it was done so well. The two girls decide they're going to come together and try to find a wormhole and go back and change things. And it's just kind of about what happens as a result. It's so good. It was done very, very well. And so definitely like reading those kind of back to back with each other, you could see the similarities, you could see the differences, and I definitely preferred the one over the other. So anyway, Shape of Thunder got 5 stars for me. All right. Sorry, Anyway, another middle grade one that I read from NetGalley that I believe came out in April, it came out in April. It's called The Sun Will Come Out, and this one was so good. It's by Joanne Levy, and it is about a girl who is going to camp for, I don't know if I think it's for the first time, and she's planning on going with her best friend, and then her best friend ends up getting to go to horse camp instead, which is so much better, but she can't go because her parents can't afford it. And so she ends up going to another camp, and it's actually a Jewish camp. And so it's all about the Jewish culture and things like that. But she gets to camp and she starts having kind of panic attacks where she gets hives all the time. And it's really embarrassing, and she's super embarrassed. And she meets a new friend, and it has to do with crushes. And the one thing that not the one thing, but one of the things that I loved about this is that as part of the camp, like what's going on is they're doing a musical and they do Annie, and I love Annie. And so they keep talking about the different characters and the music and all of that. And so that's definitely a part of the plot. But she also meets the camp director's son, who has I don't remember, he's different. We'll just say that. He's different. He looks a little different, and she gets to know him and know what's going on with him. And it's about their friendship, and it was so much fun. It definitely had me in the mood to watch Parent Trap because of just the camp section of that movie. I love the camp. I like the whole idea of going to camp for a whole month in the summer. I think is just so much fun. And I kind of want to be a kid and go to camp in the summer now, and whatever. But this was so good. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. Okay, and then the last book that I read this month, you guys, I got approved on NetGalley for an audio arc of Being Clem. And so, of course, I listened to it as soon as I got approved for it. This is the 3rd book in the Finding Langston series by Lisa Klein Ransom. It says it's the final book. I'm still holding out hope that we're going to get a book about Errol, but I don't know. We don't know if that's going to happen or not. Anyway, this is about Clem. His father is killed in a massive, I think it's the Port Chicago fires in World War II. The history behind that I had never heard of was appalling. Like, oh my goodness. Anyway, and so his mom is now a single mom who's trying to figure out how to provide for her family, and it's just proving to be a lot. She ends up having to take on a job that she doesn't want to, and the stress of that is kind of coming down on the rest of the kids in the family. And so it's just about him trying to find his footing in his family, and he's kind of treated as the baby of the family, and he's growing up and he wants to take on more responsibility. And it has to do with his relationships at school, and it has to do with his extended family, and he has this fear of swimming, and so that definitely plays into it a lot with him learning how to swim because his dad was in the Navy and was a great swimmer, and he wants to live up to his dad's name. And there were a lot of moving parts, I will say, in this book. That's something that kind of differed between this one and the other ones, is that there were a lot of different components. I still loved it. I still love Lisa Klein Ransom's writing, but of the 3, this wasn't my favorite, but it was still totally worth the read. Definitely taught me a lot. Once again, is set during kind of that Great Migration period in Chicago. His family does not move during the book, but it is set during that time frame in Chicago. So it was still absolutely fantastic. So definitely check out Being Clem. so glad that I got the e-arc. Dion Graham is the narrator, and he is hands down now one of my favorite new narrators. So highly suggest checking this out. It comes out on August 3rd. So that's it. Those are the 10 books that I read in July. So like I said, I'm still in the middle of a couple. So those will be getting wrapped up here in the first couple of days of August. But yeah, if you have read any of these, if you're looking forward to any of these, let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, other than that, I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you stick around and subscribe. And until next time, see ya!